I love art museums. I love museums of all kinds, and I'm an English professor, and so I'm just announcing that it was a dream come true to make this box of boxes, and give this talk is also just totally fun. So I'm going to talk quickly about why I think it's fun and interesting to think about storytelling in images or graphic storytelling. I don't demand that people like graphic storytelling. I do demand that people find it interesting to think about graphic storytelling. And generally speaking, when I talk to people about comics, which I do constantly, because even people who hate comics want to talk to me about comics, what becomes clear is that you may hate comics, but it's still fun to think about them in one way or another. And I'm going to just say a couple things about it. Two of the comics that are in this display. So in my old age, my old pedagogical age, I've become absorbed by the challenge of asking and trying to answer in compelling ways really simple questions. My students, I have several of my student collaborators with us today. Your support is very much appreciated, as always. My students know this. I ask questions like, what difference does it make that a sonnet has 14 lines in it? Or to ask another one, a harder one, I think, for this room, why are almost all two-dimensional works of art in the West rectilinear? They could be any shape. They happen to be almost all rectilinear. I like questions like that. There are good hard ones about stories, about narratives. Why do we tell ourselves the stories that we tell? Why is storytelling so profoundly important in human culture? About a decade or so ago, I think that's about when it was, I started asking myself these kinds of simple questions about stories and form, or the form of stories. As a professor, as a student of expressive culture, I've always been absorbed by one of those two things, stories or form. So the forms of stories. For instance, how short can a story be and still be a story? What parts do stories typically have? Why don't they have those parts rather than some other parts? The way I work on things like that these days is always in class. So I started teaching a 100 level class in which I used a whole bunch of different storytelling modes. Plays, films, poems, novels, and on a kind of whim, a comic book. I was doing in that class, we did Homer's Odyssey, which is a poem. When students talked about it in class, they almost always referred to it as a novel. And I would interrupt them and say, no, it's a poem. And they go, well, anyway, in this novel, Odysseus does. Anyway, I used a classic comic version of the Odyssey. Surely some of you read classic comics at some point in your lives. And you can see the idea, the fun thing about the classic comic is that it's exactly the same story, told in a different medium. And if you do that, it turns out you can see things instantly about both of those objects, just by seeing the difference between them. So it was kind of all downhill from there for me. That is, running downhill. Graphic storytelling of various kinds turned out to be really fun classroom material. And I've now taken classes totally on graphic storytelling. It's fun classroom material. It's also really useful. It's incredibly useful classroom material. If you want to have your students think about form, comics make it really easy because in graphic storytelling the form is literally just sitting there right in front of your eyes. Boxes. The images are in boxes. In a comic strip, boxes of often a set number of boxes, a set size of box. So in class, if you ask students a question like, why is it interesting that the sonnet has 14 lines, they develop that look that all professors are familiar with, which is not only, you shouldn't call on me, but more than that, I am actively not thinking about this. I just want you to know that I'm not thinking about why, so don't even think. Even in this discussion, I'm going to be able to contribute. We talk about poetry, which is by and large a genre not familiar to modern readers in any deep way, I can ask, they can read a poem and I'll say how many lines are in it, and they won't have any idea. The students will not know how many lines are in the poem that they just read. How long were the lines? I won't know that. If I show them the same students a Mutt and Jeff cartoon, comic strip, say from 1913, which in many ways is a very foreign and odd object. Mutt and Jeff, they talk about stuff that is really quite hard to understand. They make jokes that you just are assuming are jokes, because you really don't understand them. You're just thinking, I guess that was funny in 1913. In certain ways, a quite foreign object, you ask students about the form of that, everybody in class is ready to go instantly. 6 boxes, simple as pie. How are the figures drawn? Simple. How is the background used? Simple. So, for a teacher of expressive culture, graphic storytelling it's a gift from heaven. All the things that you typically want your students to think about are just sitting there. And it's not hard for people to see them. You just ask them, and it's painfully obvious in a way what is there. So one way to think about that is what graphic storytelling does, is it makes the decisions that the artists make in constructing their stories, in this case, highly visible. And once you start thinking about what decisions the artist has made, you've made a lot of progress in thinking about the object. So as this gallery demonstrates, the tradition of telling stories in pictures, or a mixture of pictures and words, is a long and rich one. We have these two images that Peter was just talking about, which are storytelling images. Around the corner, you could find some Hogarth engravings, which do it in it. Storytelling in a single image is very challenging. The static images it is very difficult to communicate the passage of time in a single static image. And Peter was just talking about some of the quite elaborate techniques used in traditional picture storytelling to try to get time moving, or to try to insert time into a static image. There's a number of really sophisticated engagements with this problem in this gallery. One traditional approach, which Peter was just talking about in these two images, is to use a story that we know already. And in different ways, I'm sure that all of you, when you looked at these images, you all were focused in on the sense that Peter was talking about already. But the only way that images like this can do that density of work is that people know that story. They know the story of the Passion. They know the objects. They know the things in it. And there are other ones in this period. The story of the Virgin is used in a similar way. These images have a very strong pre-existing environment in which they live, a pre-existing narrative environment. And they're in that environment, and people understand that environment. And hence, even the complicated things that Peter was describing that these images are doing, because the narrative environment is so well understood, those things become legible. Legibility is a term that my students and I have started using as a way of describing this feature of graphic storytelling. Graphic image storytellers struggle with and think about legibility all the time. How can you make the story you're telling legible to the viewer? How can you help the viewer understand what the story is that you're telling? And the older graphic storytellers, who by and large had a single image, sometimes, as in Hogarth's case, a stack of 6 images to tell a very long story. They do all these tricks that you would recognize right away. I don't need to tell you about them. In the Hogarth image around the corner, one of them has a table that's falling over. And then the next one, the table has fallen. That's one way of depicting storytelling time, but even the one with the table not standing up, not falling over, but falling over, it's a way of summoning both the past, because we can picture the way it was when it was standing up, and the future, because we know it's falling and we know it will. the older tradition uses those things all the time. Hogarth does that stuff all the time. I think he was quite frustrated by being captive to static images. Modern, we have these three, there's some brilliant thinking that produced this Hopper and the Soth photograph and then the Crutzen photograph in this gallery. These are great things. They're obviously talking to each other in really interesting ways. Those are 20th century works, 20th century art, and 20th century storytelling. Often likes to frustrate narrative coherence. So the Hopper and the Crutzen, for instance, are actively resisting giving you information which would allow you to place it in a story, that would allow you to give you a picture of what was just happening or what might happen soon, in a way that someone like Hogarth would not be interested in that. Right? So the comic strip, thinking about that, thinking about the ways that people are trying to tell stories in pictures, make those stories legible. The comic strip is a very specific and amazingly successful way of telling understandable, legible stories using mostly pictures. And in particular, they can depict the forward flow of time in a controlled way. And they have a specific way of handling and encouraging the knowledge of the reader, the knowledge of the story by the reader. So the comic strip appears very suddenly and specifically, which is interesting. I think that's interesting. That is, those of us who have thought a lot about the history of comics think we know what the first comic strips were, which is in a New York paper. It featured a character called the Yellow Kid. As usual, this is a professorial thing. The reason I can make that dramatic statement is it depends on these various definitions that I've applied to the term comic strip. Because there's all kinds of graphic storytelling before that, and there's storytelling in pictures in boxes, in sequential boxes even. But comic strips, as we know them and as they became extravagantly popular in the 20th century in America, it's a distinctive form. I think it is a distinctive form. Storytelling time flows left to right in boxes in the same way that words do. They feature a continuing and consistent story world, one that you know. And in that way, they use a continuing character. So the Yellow Kid was a character appearing actually in these very complex, dense, single panel, single page images in 1896. And the artist, whose name is Outcall, suddenly started making comic strips out of it. So 6 boxes, time flowing left to right, the Yellow Kid in each box doing the same thing, and it's the same world every time. He has friends that you know, he has a bedroom that you know, he does things that you understand. So that is a distinct form, and it takes off like a rocket. By 1905, there are comic strips in every daily paper in the United States. So the constant revisiting of a continuous and easily understood story world is the fundamental feature of the commercial comic strip as it appeared in American culture. That technique of a highly stable world that the reader knows allows for great advantages in legibility in telling the story. Because you don't have to tell the reader hardly anything before you tell the small story that you're interested in on that particular day. It really is the modern and everyday, perhaps even banal, equivalent of the kind of technique that's being used in these two Renaissance images. Those depend upon the knowledge of the story that the viewer brings to the image. Comic strips depend on the same thing. They just teach it to you themselves. And it's really not such a complicated story. Like in Mutt and Jeff, Mutt is tall, Jeff is short. Jeff always wears evening clothes for a reason that we really can't ever figure out. And that's pretty much it. Jeff does have a tendency to get punched by Mutt. The modern parallel, which I'm assuming a lot of you know, is Garfield. Garfield is a gang strip like Mutt and Jeff. Like many early strips, so Garfield loves food, Odie, the little dog, is stupid, John is afraid of girls, and so on. And every story, tiny little stories that these strips tell, is located in that. It's a little episode, it's an exercise inside that story world. So that's how Mutt and Jeff works. Mutt and Jeff is in this. This is, it's a comic strip. You don't even need to know what's happening here. It's just, you can see, Mutt and Jeff is a great example of the traditional comic focus on legibility. Not very much in the boxes, making sure that people understand it. I printed these two out because Jeff he's getting things thrown at him there, and he's being hit by something there. That's the typical Mutt and Jeff plot. Here's how it works. Mutt and Jeff enter in the first frame, set up a couple of boxes of trouble. In the next two boxes, some kind of crisis. Jeff gets punched. Which helps us remember the source of that word in pantomime, literally, a punchline. And then the sixth box, these are long comic strips. There was some kind of a flattening of the story. Papers, 20 years into Mutt and Jeff's run, eliminated the sixth box. Wouldn't let Bud Fisher use it, and so his stories actually became more compressed. This little arc. So every Mutt and Jeff strip is this little arc with this little flat tail at the end. The images don't have to do a lot of detailed or sophisticated work. Their job is to be highly legible. So that's something you totally understand, right? Because you know about comic strips. You only have to read like 10 of them before you know all about comic strips. So about 25 years later, this is an image which is in the box. So this is a Flash Gordon Sunday strip. Flash Gordon was made by a guy named Alex Raymond. It started in the mid-30s. It's a Sunday-only storytelling strip. So it only appears once a week. In Flash Gordon, and I just want you to, you can't see it, but again, it's a comic strip, doesn't matter. So you can see the vestigial presence of the regular comic strip in this. It's not really a comic strip because of its interest in the big box, in the page. But it is kind of a comic strip, right? Because you have got that box, and you have that box, and you have that box. And it does, time actually flows in story time. It flows from left to right in the usual way. Raymond is not very interested in keeping control of us. That is, he's letting us wander around in this image. And in fact, when you first see it, you don't really know exactly what to do with it or where the central action is or what kind of narrative flow is happening. The images in Alex Raymond are doing way more work than they do in Mutt and Jeff. And in fact, the images have been loaded with so much narrative work that my students and I often felt that that they had been pressed beyond their capacity. You can't really understand the story, actually, frequently, in this period of Flash Gordon. This has become an exercise in comic strip virtuosity. And as a result, the storytelling burden, the legibility of the image has been pressed right to the edge. And in this image, the fun thing that Raymond is doing here, so it's essentially, it's not exactly a riff on comic strip structure because he's not being ironic in any way. It's a play on boxes moving from left to right. Highly legible image there, highly legible image there, that story time flowing that way. And then, in this curious way, the action of the strip is actually going from right to left through the middle of what is not really a central box, but which is the box that contains the other two boxes. As usual in Raymond, there's these sinuous lines. You see his interest in curvature, which is actually a traditional technique that's a way of helping, of summoning motion and hence producing a little bit of time on either side. If something is curved, it might be straight. You get that feeling of movement. So the comic strip is kind of a vestige in Raymond, and as a result, the narrative is not really his main focus. His main focus actually has become making these extravagant and interesting images, it was hugely tiring for him. And by 1938, he's not doing it at all. They're just boxes, 6 boxes. He gives up. This period in the mid-30s is the high point. I would say it's the high point for the comic strip as a storytelling medium in American culture. In this period in the mid-30s, you have comic strips that will tell 6-month story arcs in daily strips. You have this kind of thing, which takes up a lot of space on the page. The newspaper, this is expensive space. And after the mid-30s, actually, newspapers stopped being interested in investing that amount of money in that kind of large color image. Because what Raymond wants to do is so extravagant, you do feel that the comic strip has been pushed kind of to the edge of what it can do. And so, if you could move down the box, and when you look at it later, the next thing is the comic book. That is, if you want to tell extravagant, long, detailed stories, you'll need something else. That turns out to be the comic book, which has lots and lots of boxes and lasts for much longer than the 3 boxes to the punchline. And that happens in 1938 with Superman. Anyway, so that's my stuff about these movies. Thanks for coming.